people who are going to lend you their credibility. These are really pivotal and important to any sort of successful creative endeavor. And so even though the sort of mythology of creativity is that it's very individual centric, the reality is that it's a group or community activity.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you so much. So how do certain people experience a flash of genius? So what's the definition of the flashes of genius?
Yeah, so one of the sort of phenomenon in sort of the creativity sort of literature is this idea of a flash of genius, which is also called an aha moment or a light bulb moment. But it's this idea that creatives, we have this sort of moment where an idea just suddenly hits them. And the issue is that for a lot of us, we hear those stories and then we say, okay, well, if I'm not just having randomly great ideas, well, then I must not be creative. And the problem is, and I talk about this at length in the book, is that in reality, these flashes of genius, these light bulb moments, are the output. They're not the input. They're the output of long years of intense amount of work and preparation and information consumption. And since our brain is actually very good at coming up with new and interesting combinations of ideas, if we give it the raw materials to work with, we'll inherently have these flashes of genius and we'll have these aha moments. And so even though they're sort of mystical and even though they can be hard to pin down, they're actually something that's fundamentally understandable.
Oh, wow. This is really amazing. Thank you so much for explaining. Okay, so what makes certain ideas take off?
So I think what's interesting is that, one of the big questions when it comes to creativity is this idea of how do you develop the right idea at the right time? Because it's not enough to just be skilled, right? You could be a very talented painter, but if you just paint a reproduction of a painting that already was painted, clearly you're not being creative. And so as a result, creativity is not just about sort of pure craftsmanship, but it's also about that ability to create the right idea at the right time. And that's where I think for a lot of people, creativity can seem really overwhelming. It can seem really scary. But if you think about and you approach the idea of timing in the same way that you think about developing your actual craft, whether that's painting or drawing or anything, what you find is that you can actually develop a better sense of timing. And so there's a lot of ways you can do this. I talk about this in the book, but like one example is that if you go and actually start consuming a lot of specialized information or a lot of content in your narrow vertical, what you find is that over time, you start to develop a good sense of what is that right level of old and new. What is something that's familiar enough to feel safe, but novel enough to be interesting and exciting? And so consumption, sort of paradoxically, is actually one of the key ways you can start creating more.
Oh, so is there like a kind of momentum to start? So according to what you say, if the people, they want to be more creative, something like that, but they just like, okay, I stop. How can do you have any advice or suggestions that help them to break that point?
Yeah, I think one of the things you can do is actually build a creative community around yourself. So one thing I found is that successful creatives tend to have a sort of a friend group that is also a creative group. And so oftentimes these are people in their same exact sort of field. And this is useful for a few reasons. One, there's sort of a transference of knowledge. So they teach each other things. There's also sort of friendly competition where, okay, if my friends are also in this field, then I feel some pressure to do better. But there's more importantly an emotional support where when you're feeling down or you're feeling like maybe I can't do this, you have those people around you who can sort of give you that subtle push so that you keep going. And so I really think that if you're trying to sort of break through, especially break through any sort of creative rut, making sure you have a strong creative community around you is really the first step.
Okay, it's excellent. The answer is, it's like some people say, if you hang out with 5 millionaires, you will be the sixth. It's the same concept, right?
Totally.
Okay. So you interview a lot of success people, totally around 150, right? Successful people you interviewed. So who were your favorites and why?
In the book, I interviewed this guy named David Rubenstein, who's a billionaire. He's a very famous sort of finance mogul. And what I thought was so interesting is he's had a very long, successful career. And when I talked to him, what I was really fascinated by is he tried to turn the interview around, we started asking me questions about big data, which is sort of my historical specialty. And he started asking me all these questions. And I was like, I'm trying to interview you. But what was sort of telling about it was that he approaches every interaction as an opportunity to learn, as an opportunity to be curious. And it's not a surprise that he's had this very long career and been able to continually reinvent himself because he's always stayed curious. And since creativity is about a blend of the old and the new, if you start focusing too much on what you've done in the past, you'll start to get that ratio wrong.
Okay, so this is also what to learn, I think, right? Already in like the momentum of curiosity. So what is something we can do to become more creative?
Well, I think one thing that's really important is to, we talked about consumption, we talked about the idea of building a creative community, but another thing that I think is really critical is changing your perspective on feedback. So I think a lot of people, when they hear stories of creatives, they sort of imagine them going off, by themselves and writing some, great novel. But the reality is the most successful creatives are highly reliant on feedback, and they revise and they edit and they iterate on their work constantly. And the reason why is that your job as a creative is not to create something that's perfect for you. Your job as a creative is to create something that the audience will resonate with. And so you need to make your audience part of your creativity process. And when you do that, what you find is that your ideas become much, much, much better. And so learning that sort of love of iterations is a very pivotal step to becoming more successful at creativity.
I see. Okay. So why are certain companies so much more successful in building a culture of creativity, according to your experience?
Yeah, so what I found is that the companies that are really good at building a creative culture are able to develop a sense of psychological safety. So what I mean by that is that people aren't afraid that, if I try something and I fail, that I'm going to get fired, or I'm going to get demoted, or I'm going to not get a raise. Instead, what those companies do is they build psychological safety, where it's okay to fail, it's okay to experiment. And the way they're able to do this is by going through a little mental shift. So the way I like to think about it is companies that are good at this, they change their mindset from their product is not the end product. Instead, their product is their innovation process. And they're continually trying to refine their innovation process, continually trying to make it better. And as a result, when something fails, well, as long as there's lessons for their innovation process, it's not really a failure. And that builds a sense within the organization that, okay, we can actually experiment, we can actually be creative, and we have psychological safety. And so that is really the pivotal thing. If you want to build a team that has a strong sense of creativity, you have to first invest in building psychological safety.
Okay, got it. I have the other question about the Western and the Eastern. So do you have any chance to work with like Asian together? Do you find any like a difference between the creativity, the concept of creativity in Asian culture and different, maybe quite different to Western culture?
Yeah, great question. So what you find is that a lot of how we perceive creativity is culturally focused. So for example, in the West, we have sort of this notion of creativity as this sort of very individual act of these sort of very godlike people that maybe are a bit eccentric, but we view them in very positive lights. Mm-hmm. And historically, in sort of more Eastern cultures, what you say is that there's already sort of more of a group dynamic. There's already more of a perception of it sort of takes multiple people to get something done. And as a result, that influences how we perceive creativity. We don't just think of it as individual centric. We think of it more in sort of that group dynamic.
Okay. This is really insightful. Thank you so much. And so you talk about the power of imitation. Can you explain what it is and how it works?
Can you repeat the question?
You talk about the power of imitation, right? So can you explain it?
I can't. The word you're saying, impatient?
No. Imitation.
Oh, imitation. Oh, yeah. Yeah, of course. Sorry about that. It's hard to hear. Yeah, so one of the things is that a lot of times with creativity, we think about radical novelty, right? We have to create something that's really new, that's really different. But since creativity is about a blend of the old and the new, one thing I found is that successful creatives tend to go through intense periods of imitation where they look at past great successes and they study it. What is the structure of a great novel or a great song or a successful startup? And by learning those sort of familiar baselines, they can then learn, okay, how do I add my own novel twist to that? Because your job as a creative isn't to reinvent how a novel is told. It's not to reinvent the sort of plot or story arc of a movie. Your job is to add your own novel interpretation to that. And so I think that idea of imitation is something that sometimes seems scary because we don't want to plagiarize, but there's a big difference between imitating the structure of sort of great work and actually copying the content of it. And once you become comfortable with imitation, you actually find it's easier to become original because you know sort of where to play and where to be original.
Oh, yes, true, true. So what trend are you most excited for right now? What trend?
I think right now what you're seeing is interesting is this sort of idea of the creator economy and just, people starting to, monetize their own creativity and doing that in smaller scales and in ways that have less gatekeepers. I think that's really exciting. Sort of on the optimistic side, I tend to think that you'll see more interesting niches emerge. And, for example, if you're an artist and you have sort of a peculiar style, well, now it's probably easier to build a career monetizing that because you can access people from all over the globe and there's ways in which they can support you through the internet. And so to me, that's a really exciting trend. And I'm very curious to see sort of what are the long tail effects of that. Does that mean more people go into creativity? Does it just mean people who are creatives are happier? Like, what are the outcomes of that? I think is really fascinating.
I see. So what motivate you to write this book? It's not successful overnight. Sorry, it's like translate overnight other languages as well. So it's really impactful around the world. Even we have like a Chinese version. So I just want to know, so the whole is that process for a few years for you to incubate such idea and then write a book. And because I think it's not only you write it, right? You have idea, you also interview a lot of people from your life experience in business, combine all together. It's a lot of wisdom coordinated in your book as well. So may you share with us?
So for me, I mean, the motivation for the book was I was working with a lot of marketers and entrepreneurs, and I would hear this sort of line from them that, oh, well, I'm not that creative, right? That's not me. I'm not that person. And I tend to get kind of frustrated. And I was just sort of like, what are you talking about? Like you are creative. Like and a lot of times these people are actually people who do a lot of creative work. And so I just started noticing that a lot of people have a lot of negative self-talk when it comes to creativity. And I'm someone who gets sort of frustrated when people limit their own potential. And so the book sort of came out of this feeling, this sort of urge to sort of correct the record when it came to creativity.
I see. So how long it took for you?
The book took about 3 years to fully sort of research, write, and come out.
That's quite a long time.
Yes.
Wow. That's why. It's excellent. So which type of reader that you recommend them to read your book, buy your book?
I mean, I think it's really about anyone who's trying to become more creative. So you could be an artist, you could be a marketer, you can be an entrepreneur. But I think if you're looking to be very intentional about how you spend your time and get better at your craft, the book is for you. If you're sort of feeling very comfortable and settled and you don't want to rock the boat, the book isn't for you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, because we have some technical issues, so I want to ask you again for the question 1, please. Okay, so may you just explain what is the biggest misconception about creativity among all of us?
The biggest misconception about creativity is that it's an individual act. So, we have this idea of these sort of famous creatives who sort of go off and do their creativity all by themselves, and they're able to create these amazing things. But the reality is that we know that creativity is a community act. We know that you need teachers. We know that you need mentors. We know that you need a support group. We know that you need people who help lend you their reputation and build you up. And so to me, that notion of creativity as being very individual centric, I think is probably the most problematic, but also one of the most pervasive myths when it comes to creativity.
Okay, got it. Okay, so anything you want to talk with our audience? So this interview will go to China as well. So anything you want to share and talk with the audience?
No, I really appreciate you and having me on. If you want to learn more, you can go to allen.xyz, ALLEN, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So let's talk soon. So anyone, if they want to contact you or connect with you, any channel that they can contact you like directly?
Yeah, if you go to my website, allen.xyz, you can email me. I have links to all my social media. I'm pretty responsive, so feel free to drop me a note.
Thank you so much. Okay, so this section